I've been the groundskeeper and administrator at Moonrise Hills Cemetery in Ashford, Connecticut, for 20 years. Last month, I submitted my resignation. You can call me Eleanor Blackwood if you want, though most people in town just knew me as the cemetery keeper. In 2 decades, I've handled every kind of burial, every family crisis, and every strange request you can imagine when it comes to laying people to rest. But what I'm about to tell you is about the one burial that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Moonrise Hills Cemetery sits on 200 acres of rolling countryside just outside Ashford, Connecticut, about 45 minutes northeast of Hartford. It's been in continuous operation since 1847, making it one of the oldest active burial grounds in Windham County. The cemetery serves not just Ashford, but the surrounding towns of Eastford, Woodstock, and Union, creating a community of families whose burial plots span generations, going back to the Civil War era. When I took over as head groundskeeper and administrator in 2004, Moonrise Hills contained approximately 15,000 graves, spread across dozens of sections, each with its own character and history. Section A holds the oldest burials, with weathered granite stones bearing names like Ezra Whitmore and Temperance Goodwin. Section M, where most of our story takes place, was developed in the 1960s and contains more modern granite markers, arranged in neat rows beneath towering maple trees. During my tenure, I've overseen more than 2,800 burials, managed the maintenance of every headstone and monument, coordinated with funeral directors from 7 different mortuaries, and handled the complex logistics of operating a cemetery that serves multiple communities. I've dealt with every imaginable situation: families fighting over burial arrangements, bodies that arrived without proper documentation, graves that had to be relocated due to flooding, and the occasional person who showed up claiming their supposedly dead relative was still alive. What I'm about to tell you started as what seemed like a routine administrative mix-up, but evolved into something that challenged everything I thought I understood about death, time, and the nature of reality itself. The case began on September 14, 2022, when I received a call from Patricia Whitehaven at Whitehaven and Associates Funeral Home in nearby Willimantic. Patricia had been in the funeral business for over 30 years, and I'd worked with her on hundreds of arrangements over the years. She was calling about a woman named Isadora Nightingale, who had passed away the previous evening at Windham Hospital. "Eleanor," Patricia said, her voice carrying an unusual note of confusion, "I've got a situation here that I've never encountered before. This woman, Isadora Nightingale, left very specific burial instructions, including a prepaid plot at Moonrise Hills. But when I went to verify the plot location, I think there might be an error in your records." Isadora Nightingale had been 82 years old when she died of complications from pneumonia. According to Patricia, she had been living alone in a small cottage on Pomfret Road for the past decade, following the death of her husband. She had no children, no immediate family that anyone could locate, and had become increasingly reclusive in her final years. Their only regular contact with the outside world had been her weekly visits to the Ashford Library, where she would check out mystery novels and historical biographies. The confusion Patricia mentioned centered around plot 156J in Section M, which according to Isadora's paperwork was the burial site she had purchased and paid for in advance. The problem was that when Patricia visited the cemetery to inspect the plot, she found it was already occupied. "Eleanor, there's already a headstone there," Patricia explained. "It reads Isadora Nightingale, 1940 to 1997, beloved wife and scholar. But the woman who just died was born in 1940 and died in 2022. It's the exact same name and birth year as whoever is supposedly buried in that plot 25 years ago." I immediately drove to Section M to investigate. Plot 156J was located in a particularly beautiful area of the cemetery, beneath a canopy of sugar maples that turned brilliant orange and red each fall. The headstone was exactly as Patricia had described, a simple granite marker reading Isadora Nightingale, 1940 to 1997, beloved wife and scholar. The stone was weathered in a way consistent with 25 years of New England weather. Moss had begun growing in the engraved letters, and the granite had developed a subtle patina that comes from decades of exposure to rain, snow, and seasonal temperature changes. There was no question that this marker had been in place for many years. I returned to my office and pulled the burial records for plot 156J. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. The plot had been purchased on March 3, 1997, by someone named Jonathan Nightingale, presumably Isadora's husband. The burial permit was properly filed, signed by Dr. Marcus Chen, who had been the coroner at that time. The funeral arrangements had been handled by Riverside Memorial Services, a funeral home that had gone out of business in 2005. According to our records, Isadora Nightingale had died on October 15, 1997, and had been buried on October 18 of that same year. The documentation included Jonathan Nightingale's signature authorizing the burial, his contact information, and even a copy of the check he had written for the burial services. But there was an immediate problem with this timeline. When I cross-referenced our records with county death certificates, I discovered that Jonathan Nightingale himself had died on September 22, 1997, nearly a month before his wife's supposed burial. According to the official records, Jonathan had died of a heart attack at Hartford Hospital, and his own burial had taken place at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford. If Jonathan had died in September of 1997, how could he have arranged his wife's burial in October of that same year? How could he have signed paperwork and written checks from beyond the grave? I decided to dig deeper into the 1997 records. I contacted Dr. Marcus Chen, who was now retired, but still living in the area. Dr. Chen had served as county coroner for 15 years, and had handled thousands of death certificates during his tenure. Eleanor, Dr. Chen told me when I called him, I remember that case, actually. It was unusual because the woman had been found in her home several days after her death. She had apparently died alone, and it wasn't until neighbors noticed that her mail was piling up that anyone checked on her. Dr. Chen's memory of the case was remarkably clear. He recalled that Isadora had been found in her study, surrounded by books and papers, as if she had simply fallen asleep while reading. There had been no signs of foul play, no indication of suffering. She had simply passed away peacefully in her chair. But here's what was strange, Dr. Chen continued. When I examined the body, the decomposition suggested she had been dead for only a day or two, despite neighbors saying they hadn't seen her for over a week. It was like time had somehow slowed down for her after death. I asked Dr. Chen about Jonathan Nightingale and the funeral arrangements. His response sent a chill down my spine. That's what I never understood about that case, he said. According to my records, there was no husband. Isadora Nightingale was listed as a widow on her death certificate. Her emergency contact was listed as none, and the funeral arrangements were handled by the estate through a lawyer named Richard Blackthorne. This contradiction was impossible to explain. Our cemetery records clearly showed Jonathan Nightingale arranging and paying for his wife's burial, but the coroner's records showed Isadora as a widow with no family contact. One set of official records had to be wrong, but both appeared to be authentic and properly documented. I contacted Richard Blackthorne's law office, hoping to get more information about the 1997 burial arrangements. The receptionist informed me that Mr. Blackthorne had retired 5 years earlier, but she was able to connect me with his former partner Sarah Nightshade, who had taken over many of his estate cases. I remember the Nightingale estate, Sarah told me. Richard handled it personally because it was such an unusual situation. Isadora had been a retired literature professor at the University of Connecticut, and she had left very specific instructions about her burial arrangements. She had apparently been planning her own funeral for years. According to Sarah's records, Isadora had written detailed instructions about every aspect of her burial, including the specific plot location at Moonrise Hills, the wording for her headstone, and even the type of flowers to be placed on her grave. She had also prepaid for everything, including a substantial endowment for the ongoing care of her burial plot. But here's what was really strange, Sarah continued. Isadora's instructions were dated 1995, 2 years before her death. In those instructions, she specifically mentioned that she wanted to be buried when the time comes in 2022. She wrote about her death as if she knew exactly when it would happen, 27 years in the future. This information made the situation even more bewildering. The 1997 Isadora had apparently known she would die again in 2022. It was as if she had been planning for multiple deaths decades in advance. I decided to examine the 1997 burial site more carefully. With the permission of the cemetery board, I arranged to have plot 156J examined by ground-penetrating radar to determine what exactly was buried there. The results were conclusive. There was definitely a casket buried at the proper depth, in the exact location where our records indicated Isadora Nightingale had been interred in 1997. But I needed to understand how the same woman could die twice, 25 years apart, and somehow arrange her own burial arrangements from beyond the grave. I began researching Isadora Nightingale's life, hoping to find some explanation for the impossible timeline I was uncovering. What I discovered was that Isadora had been a professor of comparative literature at the University of Connecticut from 1965 until her retirement in 1995. She had specialized in Gothic literature and folklore, with particular expertise in stories about death, resurrection, and supernatural occurrences. Her academic papers, which I found archived at the university library, included extensive research into historical accounts of people who had supposedly died and returned to life. One of her final academic papers, published just months before her retirement, was titled Temporal Displacement in Death Narratives, When Linear Time Fails to Contain Human Experience. In this paper, Isadora argued that certain individuals throughout history had experienced death as a non-linear event, dying multiple times across different periods of their lives, with each death serving a different purpose in their overall existence. At the time, her colleagues had dismissed this work as overly speculative and not sufficiently grounded in empirical research, but reading it now, in light of what I was discovering about her own death timeline, her academic theories seemed less like speculation and more like personal experience. The most disturbing part of my research came when I found Isadora's personal effects, which had been stored in our cemetery's administrative office since 1997. Among her belongings was a leather-bound journal that she had apparently been writing in up until her death. The final entry, dated October 14, 1997, one day before her supposed death, read, "The preparations are complete. I have arranged everything for both occasions, though I suspect only Eleanor will understand the true nature of what I have done. Time is not as linear as we pretend it to be, especially when it comes to death. I will see Jonathan again in the place between moments, and then I will return to finish what I started. The waiting will be the hardest part, but 25 years is not so long when you understand that all time happens at once." This journal entry mentioned me by name, even though I wouldn't begin working at Moonrise Hills for another 7 years. Isadora had somehow known, in 1997, that I would be the one to uncover her story in 2022. She had written about me as if we had already met, as if our connection was inevitable and predetermined. But the most chilling part of the journal entry was her mention of Jonathan. According to all the records I had found, Jonathan Nightingale had died in September of 1997, before Isadora's first death, yet her journal suggested they would meet in the place between moments, and that she would somehow return to finish something she had started. I was beginning to realize that I wasn't dealing with an administrative error or a case of mistaken identity. Somehow, Isadora Nightingale had died in 1997, been properly buried in our cemetery, and then died again in 2022, with her body waiting to be buried in the same plot where she had been resting for 25 years. But the truly impossible part was yet to come, because when Patricia Whitehaven called me the next morning, she had news that would turn everything I thought I understood about this case completely upside down. "Eleanor," she said, her voice tight with confusion and something that sounded like fear, "you need to get down here immediately. It's about Isadora Nightingale. Something's happened that I can't explain, and I think you're the only person who might understand what we're dealing with." As I drove to the funeral home that morning, I had no idea that I was about to encounter something that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about death, burial, and the nature of human existence itself. The case of Isadora Nightingale was just beginning, and the most impossible part of her story was still waiting to be discovered. When I arrived at Whitehaven, an associate's funeral home that crisp September morning, Patricia was waiting for me in the parking lot. Her usual composure was completely gone, replaced by an expression I'd never seen in our 18 years of working together, genuine fear mixed with bewilderment. "Eleanor, before we go inside, I need you to prepare yourself for what you're about to see," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she lit a cigarette. "I've been in this business for 3 decades, and I've never encountered anything like this." She led me through the funeral home's back entrance, past the preparation rooms, and into the viewing area, where Isadora Nightingale's body had been placed for examination. What I saw when Patricia opened the casket door defied every natural law I thought I understood. The body lying in the casket was not the 82-year-old woman who had died at Windham Hospital 3 days earlier. Instead, it was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-50s, with dark hair barely touched by gray, and skin that showed none of the weathering and aging that should have marked 8 decades of life. "This is impossible," I whispered, staring at the impossibly youthful face. The hospital confirmed that an 82-year-old woman died. The death certificate lists her age as 82, but this woman looks like she's 55 at most. Patricia nodded grimly. "That's not even the strangest part, Eleanor. Look at this." She handed me a manila folder filled with photographs. "These are the pictures I took when the body first arrived from the hospital on September 15th. The photographs showed exactly what I would have expected: an elderly woman with white hair, deeply lined skin, and the frail appearance typical of someone in their 80s. But the woman in the casket bore no resemblance to the person in those photographs taken just days earlier. It's like she's been aging backwards since she arrived here," Patricia explained. "Every day, she looks younger. Her hair has been getting darker, her wrinkles have been disappearing, and her body seems to be reversing decades of aging. I've been documenting the changes, but I can barely believe what I'm seeing." I examined the body more closely, and Patricia was absolutely right. This was not natural decomposition or any post-mortem process I had ever heard of. The woman's skin was actually becoming more supple, her features more defined, as if death was somehow undoing the aging process. "There's something else," Patricia said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Yesterday morning, when I came to check on her, I could have sworn I saw her breathing, just for a moment. Her chest rose and fell, like she was sleeping instead of dead. I spent the next hour examining every aspect of Isadora's body and the funeral home's records. The death certificate was legitimate, signed by Dr. Rebecca Thornfield at Windham Hospital. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to pneumonia, but the woman lying in the casket showed no signs of having died from respiratory illness or having died at all. That evening, I made the decision to stay overnight at the funeral home to observe what was happening to Isadora's body. Patricia agreed to let me set up a chair in the viewing room, though she clearly thought I was losing my mind. At approximately 2:30 a.m., something happened that fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about death and the nature of human existence. Isadora Nightingale opened her eyes, not the unfocused, reflexive eye movement that sometimes occurs in the recently deceased, but a clear, conscious opening of her eyes. She turned her head toward me, focused directly on my face, and spoke in a voice that was clear and strong, despite her supposed death 3 days earlier. "Hello, Eleanor. I've been waiting for you. I should have run. I should have called for help, contacted the police, or done something rational in response to a dead woman speaking to me. Instead, I found myself leaning forward in my chair, compelled by an inexplicable sense that this conversation was inevitable and necessary. You're supposed to be dead," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. Isadora smiled, and even in the dim lighting of the funeral home, I could see that she looked even younger than she had hours earlier. The woman speaking to me appeared to be in her early 50s, with the vibrant energy of someone in the prime of life. "Death isn't as simple as people think," she replied, sitting up in the casket with fluid, graceful movements. "It's not a single event, but a process that can happen in different ways, at different times for different purposes." She explained that her academic research into death narratives hadn't been purely theoretical. She had discovered, through decades of study, that certain individuals throughout history had experienced what she called temporal displacement in dying, the ability to die multiple times across different periods of their lives, with consciousness moving freely between those death experiences. "I died in 1997, because that's when I was supposed to die according to linear time," she said, "but I also knew I would die again in 2022, because that death serves a different purpose in my overall existence." The person who died in 1997 was the scholar, the researcher, the woman who needed to understand death academically. The person who died in 2022 was the teacher, the one who needed to show someone else that death is far more complex than we imagine. I asked her why she had chosen me, why my name had appeared in her 1997 journal, why she had specifically arranged for me to be the one to uncover her story. "Because you're ready to understand," she said simply. "You've spent 20 years caring for the dead, maintaining their resting places, helping families say goodbye. You understand that death is not an ending, but a transition. You're ready to learn that the transition can happen more than once, and that consciousness doesn't always follow the rules we think it should." Isadora stood up from the casket, and I could see that she was now fully vital, completely alive, appearing to be a healthy woman in her 40s. The death that had occurred at Windham Hospital seemed to have been completely reversed. "The body that's buried in plot 156J isn't empty," she told me. "It contains the part of me that died in 1997, the scholar who completed her research and was ready to rest. But death isn't always permanent, especially for those who understand its true nature. I've been waiting 25 years to show someone that consciousness can exist outside linear time, that death can be a choice rather than an inevitability." She walked to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn darkness. "Jonathan is waiting for me in the place between moments, the space that exists between my different deaths. We've been meeting there for 25 years, continuing our conversation, our love, our existence together. But now it's time for me to choose which death to make permanent." I asked her what she meant, what choice she was facing. "I can return to the grave in 1997, allow that death to be final, and spend eternity with Jonathan in whatever comes after. Or I can choose to live again, to continue existing in this world, using what I've learned about death to help others understand its true nature." She turned back to me, and I could see the weight of this decision in her eyes. "But I can't make that choice until someone understands what I've discovered, until someone can carry this knowledge forward. That's why you're here, Eleanor. You're the bridge between my death and whatever comes next." Over the next hour, Isadora shared with me everything she had learned about death, consciousness, and the malleable nature of time. She explained that what we call death is often just one layer of existence, and that for some people, multiple deaths serve different purposes in their overall journey. She told me about others throughout history who had experienced similar temporal displacement, people who had died and returned, not as resurrection in the traditional sense, but as conscious movement between different states of existence. As dawn approached, I could see that Isadora was beginning to fade, becoming translucent around the edges, as if she was gradually returning to whatever state existed between her two deaths. "I'm going to choose the 1997 death," she told me. "Jonathan and I have waited long enough to be together permanently, but now you know that death isn't always what it appears to be. You'll encounter others who experience it differently, and you'll be able to help them understand what's happening." She handed me a small leather journal, not the one I had found in the cemetery records, but a new one, filled with her handwriting from the past 3 days. "This contains everything I've learned about consciousness and death," she said. "Use it to help others who don't understand what they're experiencing. And remember that caring for the dead isn't just about maintaining graves. It's about understanding that death is part of a much larger conversation about what it means to exist." As the first rays of sunlight entered the funeral home, Isadora Nightingale faded away completely, leaving behind only an empty casket and the journal in my hands. When Patricia arrived that morning, she found me sitting in the viewing room, holding the journal, staring at an empty casket. The security cameras showed only me, sitting alone all night, talking to no one. There was no record of Isadora's awakening, no evidence of our conversation, but the journal was real, filled with insights about death and consciousness that challenged everything modern medicine and psychology taught about the nature of human existence. And Plot 156J at Moonrise Hills Cemetery remained occupied, containing the body of a woman who had chosen to make her 1997 death permanent so she could rest beside the husband who had been waiting for her for 25 years. I submitted my resignation the following week, not because I no longer believed in my work, but because I realized I had been caring for the dead without truly understanding what death meant. Isadora had shown me that consciousness was far more complex than I had imagined, and that some mysteries were too profound for traditional professional frameworks. I now work as a grief counselor, helping families understand that death is not always the ending they think it is. Sometimes people ask me why I left cemetery work, and I tell them I discovered that caring for the dead requires understanding that death itself is more mysterious and beautiful than we ever imagined. The journal Isadora left me remains my most treasured possession, filled with wisdom about the nature of existence that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and the consciousness that bridges both states. Sometimes when I visit Moonrise Hills Cemetery, I stop by Plot 156J and leave fresh flowers. The headstone still reads Isadora Nightingale, 1940 to 1997, beloved wife and scholar, and I know that beneath that stone, she rests peacefully with Jonathan, having chosen love and permanence over the mystery of multiple deaths. That choice taught me that death, like love, is ultimately about connection to other people, to understanding, and to the profound mystery of what it means to be conscious in a universe far stranger and more beautiful than we ever dared imagine.